Ellis Island looks soft in old postcards, like the first safe breath after weeks on the Atlantic, but the truth is that for thousands of women who passed through those doors, it wasn't safety waiting on the other side. It was danger wearing a polite smile, because buried under the patriotic myths and family legends is a darker story, one about predators who learned to circle that island like sharks, waiting for the exact moment a woman stepped onto American soil alone, disoriented, broke, and desperate. And once you understand how their system worked, you start to realize Ellis Island wasn't just a gateway to hope, it was a hunting ground built right into the front door of New York City. To understand why women were so vulnerable, you gotta picture what arriving at Ellis Island was actually like. Not the soft-focus classroom version, but the real thing. Thousands of bodies packed together after days or weeks at sea, languages crashing into each other, families gripping bags that held everything they owned, steam pouring from the docks in winter air, officials barking orders, children crying, and the smell of salt, sweat, sickness, and fuel clinging to everything like a second skin. And if you were a young woman traveling alone, especially from Southern or Eastern Europe, the moment you stepped off that ship, you were already in someone's sights. The island was supposed to be a place of order, a federal checkpoint where inspectors made sure newcomers were healthy, employable, and had enough money to avoid becoming public charges. But the cracks in that system were wide enough for entire criminal networks to slip through, because even though organized crime in the mafia sense wasn't running Ellis Island, plenty of corrupt officials, runners, fixers, con men, labor agents, dockside pimps, and so-called procurement gangs were operating right under everyone's nose, and they knew exactly how to exploit every weak point in the immigration machine. One of the biggest weaknesses was the rule that single women were not supposed to leave Ellis Island unless a responsible party met them, a family member, a fiancé, an employer, someone who could vouch for them. And if no one came, the woman was kept on the island or sent to a detention dorm until the authorities figured out what to do. But this rule, meant to protect them, ended up creating opportunity for predators who learned to pose as sponsors, cousins, or employment agents, showing up just long enough to claim a woman and walk her straight into a trap the moment they reached Manhattan. And it's chilling how easy it was, because the Ellis Island staff was overwhelmed, thousands arriving every day, and background checks weren't more than a few questions shouted over the noise. So if the man showed up in a clean coat, spoke a few words of the right language, and offered a name that sounded familiar, officials often let him take the girl away, assuming he was who he said he was. And some of those men were exactly that, real family, real protectors. But others were part of vice rings that operated out of Lower Manhattan, especially around the Bowery, Chinatown, and the Tenderloin district, where brothels, workhouses, and boarding homes were nothing but front doors to exploitation. The saddest part is how predictable it all was, because the moment a girl arrived without money, without family, without language skills, and without a destination, she became a target, easy for the wrong guy to spot. And these men would whisper to each other about who looked scared, who clutched her papers too tight, who was crying, who kept looking for someone who wasn't going to show up. And once she stepped through the exit doors of Ellis Island, the city swallowed her quicker than the river swallowed coal dust. There are documented cases from the early 1900s where so-called immigration interpreters, men allowed on the island to help translate, steered women toward fake job offers, promising domestic work or factory shifts, only to hand them over to brothels that had paid the interpreters a finder's fee, and other cases where luggage handlers followed immigrant girls through the processing line, chatting them up, gaining trust, then guiding them to safe housing that turned out to be locked rooms where their papers were taken until they paid off imaginary debts. And these stories weren't rare. They showed up in city investigations, charity reports, and undercover exposés that shocked New York reformers at the time. The phrase people used back then was white slavery, a grim, sensational name for what we now call human trafficking. And even though moral panic exaggerated some stories, many were absolutely real. Young women tricked, coerced, or outright abducted outside Ellis Island by traffickers who operated with terrifying efficiency, shuttling girls from the Battery up to brothels on the east side or across the river into Hoboken. And these networks weren't run by one ethnicity or one crime family. They involved Jewish vice syndicates, Irish gangs, freelance pimps, corrupt police, and businessmen who pretended not to know what was happening in the apartments they rented out. And it wasn't just criminals outside the island. Some of the corruption was happening inside, woven into the fabric of the immigration process, because there were officials who took bribes to fast-track certain passengers, or who accepted kickbacks from employment agencies that weren't real agencies at all. And there were inspectors who quietly told a woman they'd help her get released if she agreed to work for a certain family or house. And while not every case was exploitation, enough of them were that reformers started raising alarms in newspapers, demanding investigations into how predators had built invisible pathways between Ellis Island and the city's underworld. Ellis Island processed over 12 million immigrants between 1892 and 1954, so even if a small percentage of women were targeted, the number is still enormous, and charities like the Travelers Aid Society began sending trained female social workers to the island to intercept vulnerable girls before the predators did, standing at the docks, scanning faces, jumping into conversations, physically blocking suspicious men from taking women off the island, and their presence alone shows how real the danger was. If the threat was imaginary, they wouldn't have needed a battalion of social workers just to walk immigrants from the ferry to the street. And those predators adapted fast, learning to wait not at the Ellis Island exit, but at the Battery, where the ferry unloaded, or along South Street, where girls wandered lost and confused. And there are records of girls being approached by employment agents on the walk between the ferry and the elevated train, men who flashed fake papers and promised real wages. And some women simply vanished after that walk, their names never appearing in city directories, marriage registries, or employment logs again, swallowed by the neighborhoods that fed on poverty and fear. Even the shipping companies were caught up in the mess, because some agents sold tickets to bogus safe houses that delivered women straight to sweatshops or brothels, and others charged immigrants outrageous fees for handling their luggage, knowing most women had no idea what the normal price should be. And the exploitation cut across every class of predator: petty thieves, organized vice rings, corrupt officials, and sometimes even the very people paid to protect the new arrivals. Testimonies from the era, written by women who barely spoke English, trying to explain to investigators how they were tricked, describing the way their rescuer smiled at them on the ferry, how he spoke kindly, how he offered to carry their bags, and how by the time they realized something was wrong, they were locked in a room above a saloon or in a boarding house controlled by a pimp who fronted the money for the room and then claimed they owed him for rent, food, clothes, and the boat ticket they had already paid for, trapping them in a cycle of debt they could never get out of. That's the real horror of Ellis Island's dark side. Not that the institution itself was a trafficking hub, but that the predators knew exactly how to weaponize its chaos, its crowds, its language gaps, its weak spots, and they used the island like a fishing ground stocked with vulnerable lives, grabbing women the moment they stepped onto American soil with their guard down and their dreams wide open.